Imagine a world where a man is heavily fined just for wearing the wrong fabric. A simple choice of clothing becomes a dangerous legal gamble today. A woman is forced to undergo a public physical inspection just to prove her words are true. Her dignity is sacrificed for the sake of medieval law. A farm animal is brought to court, provided with a lawyer, given a formal sentence, and eventually executed just like a human criminal would be punished. These strange occurrences were not rare anomalies. They were the actual law of the land enforced with absolute normalcy in the rhythm of daily life. What we find shocking today was once the foundation of order. Let us journey back to a time where the law controlled every single breath. Welcome to the era of strange justice. Here, the rules of survival were written in blood and tradition, governing every aspect of your very existence. In many medieval cities, what you wore was never a personal choice. Sumptuary laws strictly dictated which fabrics and colours were reserved for specific social classes. The law specified exactly which layer of society could wear silk, velvet, or lace. To dress above your station was to invite a legal disaster. An ordinary citizen was strictly forbidden from wearing silk. These materials were symbols of power that the authorities protected with a very iron fist. Only those of noble birth could wear the prestigious colours of purple or deep red. For anyone else, these colours were a ticket to heavy fines. Even the length of your shoes or the width of your sleeves was regulated. If they exceeded the legal limit, your clothing could be confiscated. Violators were often recorded as lawbreakers in official ledgers. This mark on your record could ruin your reputation and your family's standing forever. These regulations existed to maintain a rigid social order. By looking at someone's clothes, you knew exactly where they stood in the world's hierarchy. There were always those who tried to push the boundaries. Wealthy merchants often attempted to dress like the nobility to show off their growing economic power. If caught, the punishment was swift and public. Being stripped of your status-climbing clothes in front of your neighbours was a common and crushing penalty. Money could not always buy you the right to wear what you wanted. Even the rich were bound by the strict class definitions of the law. Every stitch and every thread served as a visual map of the soul's place in society. Deviation was seen as a threat to the divine order. Small acts of rebellion were common, but they carried high risks. Even a single silk ribbon could lead to a confrontation with the town's magistrates. The enforcement of these laws was constant. No detail was too small for the eyes of the law, which sought to regulate every outward appearance. No exceptions were made for the bold. The law was the law, and it governed the very fabric on your back with a cold, unyielding hand. Children grew up knowing their place through the texture of their skin against the cloth. It was a lesson in humility reinforced by the state. The visual landscape of the Middle Ages was a carefully constructed theatre of power, where every person was a pawn in a larger social game. Some laws went far beyond the clothes you wore, reaching deep into the control of the human body and the very concept of personal privacy. In certain regions, when disputes involving honour or testimony arose, a woman could be legally compelled to undergo a public physical examination to verify truth. This was not seen as a violation, but as a valid form of legal verification. The law prioritized the collective truth over the individual's bodily autonomy. There was no such thing as a private procedure. The concept of personal space as we know it today simply did not exist under these laws. Protections for the individual were non-existent. The body was seen as a piece of evidence to be examined, measured, and judged by the authorities. Those carrying out the inspections were often designated officials or chosen witnesses. Their duty was to report their findings directly to the court's judges. These events took place in the heart of the community. Crowds would gather to watch, turning a legal necessity into a grim public spectacle for all. The surrounding people didn't just watch, they were part of the process. Their presence validated the legal outcome and reinforced the power of the law. Historical legal documents show no evidence of protest against these practices. They were recorded with the same cold detachment as any other tax or trial. It was simply an accepted part of the legal system. To live in this era was to accept that your body belonged to the state's judgment. Justice was a public performance. Every act of the law was designed to be seen, felt, and remembered by every member of the local community. Privacy was a luxury the poor could never afford, and even the wealthy found their personal lives scrutinized by the prying eyes of the law. The weight of these laws created an atmosphere of constant surveillance. You were always being watched, always being measured against the standards of the time. The verdict of the body was final. In a world without DNA or modern forensics, The physical form was the ultimate witness in the court. This was the reality for centuries. A legal landscape that modern minds find abhorrent was once the bedrock of social stability and traditional justice. We look back with horror, but for them, it was just another day. The law was a force of nature, as inescapable as the winter's cold. Perhaps the most bizarre aspect of medieval law was the belief that animals were morally responsible for their actions and could be tried for crimes. Records show numerous cases where pigs were brought to trial for causing the death of a child. These were not jokes, they were serious legal matters. The trials followed full legal procedures. The animal was even provided with a defense lawyer to ensure that the process was fair and legally sound. Witnesses were called to testify against the creature. The court listened to evidence about the animal's behaviour and the circumstances of the alleged crime committed. Once the verdict was reached, the animal was sentenced. Execution by hanging was a common punishment for animals found guilty of taking a human life. These trials weren't limited to pigs. Bulls, horses, and even dogs were subjected to the same legal scrutiny and faced the same grim consequences for failure. Even pests were not exempt. If rats or locusts destroyed crops, the community might legally summon them to court to explain their destructive behaviour to judges. If the animals failed to appear, which they obviously did, the trial would proceed in their absence, and a formal sentence of excommunication or exile was issued. These accounts are meticulously recorded in legal archives. To the people of that time, it was a necessary step to restore the balance of divine justice. The animal was seen as a vessel of evil or disorder. By punishing the beast, the community felt they were purging the sin from their midst. Legal scholars debated the nuances of animal intent. Could a beast truly know right from wrong? The law eventually decided that their actions required atonement. The absurdity to us was absolute gravity to them. It reveals a worldview where everything in nature was part of a single moral legal framework. The loss of an animal to the law was a financial blow to the owner. Yet, the law took precedence over private property and economic survival. The ritual of execution was identical to that of a human. It was a somber, public warning to all creatures and people about the consequences of breaking order. Some animals were even dressed in human clothing during their trials. This symbolic act emphasized their status as temporary subjects of the king's high justice. This bizarre tradition lasted for centuries, a testament to a time when the boundaries between the human and animal worlds were strangely and legally blurred. When the sun went down, the law did not sleep. In fact, many medieval towns had strict regulations governing the nighttime activities of all their citizens. Curfews were a way of life. Once the evening bell rang, the streets became the property of the night watch and movement was strictly forbidden. If you were caught outside without a valid reason, you faced immediate arrest. The law viewed anyone wandering in the dark as a potential criminal. The purpose of these laws was simple: control. By limiting movement after dark, the authorities could prevent fires, brawls, and secret meetings of any kind. Even the time of your sleep was sometimes a matter of legal discipline. In certain communities, your daily routine was dictated by your social status. In some households and communities, servants and labourers were legally forbidden from going to bed before their masters had retired for the entire night. This was seen as a vital part of labour discipline. Your rest was not your own, it was a resource owned and controlled by your employer. These regulations remained unchanged for long periods. They were built into the very architecture of the day-to-day life that every single person had to follow. The darkness was a tool of the law. It isolated people in their homes, making them easier to manage and less likely to cause any trouble. The transition from sleep to work was also strictly timed. The morning bell was just as powerful as the evening one, signalling the return to duty. To exist was to follow a schedule that was not your own. Your very biorhythms were synchronized with the demands of the state and the church. There were no exceptions for travellers. If you arrived after the gates were locked, you spent the night outside regardless of your wealth or your status. Every aspect of life had a legal limit. The law didn't just stop at your front door, it walked right into your bedroom and your dreams. From birth to death, the rhythm of your life was set by the tolling of the bells and the watchful eyes of the local night patrol. The law provided a sense of security, but at the cost of every individual's freedom. It was a trade-off that defined the entire medieval world. Time itself was a legal construct. In this world, every second of your existence was accounted for by the rules of the kingdom and community. Marriage in the Middle Ages was far from a private affair of the heart. It was a critical legal contract with deep social implications. The law strictly governed who could marry whom. Class, family lineage, and even geographic origin were all factors that the local courts scrutinized intensely. If a marriage violated these rules, it could be legally annulled at any time. The lives of the couple and their children would be ruined. Suspicions of infidelity or dishonesty within a marriage were handled with brutal public trials. The community acted as both the judge and the jury. Punishments varied widely. In some cases, a heavy fine was enough to satisfy the law, but for many the penalty was much more personal. Public shaming was a primary tool of the law. The goal was to make an example of the offenders to prevent others from straying similarly. These rules were clearly documented and enforced by local authorities. There was no escaping the moral watchful eye of the law in your home. To marry outside your designated circle was a rebellion against the state. The law ensured that wealth and status remained within the correct social channels. Every union was a piece of a larger puzzle. The law used marriage to stabilize property rights and ensure the continued order of the feudal system. The law could reach back generations to find a reason to break a bond. Consanguinity laws were complex and often used as political or social weapons. Moral crimes were legal crimes. The line between sin and law was non-existent, making the church a powerful branch of the judicial system itself. The economic side of marriage was also heavily regulated. Contracts had to be witnessed and registered to be considered valid under the local king's law. The sheer scale of the regulation is staggering. No marriage was too small to be overlooked by the bureaucracy of the medieval legal system. Survival meant following the rules of intimacy. Your most personal choices were public property, to be judged and punished by the world around you. Even in celebration, the law was present. It dictated the length of the feast and the behaviour of the guests with an unyielding iron hand. The heart was a servant to the law. In the Middle Ages, love was a luxury, but obedience to the marriage laws was a strict necessity. Even the food on your plate was not beyond the reach of the law. What you ate and when you ate it was strictly controlled. There were specific regulations for every day of the week. Religious and state laws combined to dictate a very specific diet for the entire population. On designated fast days, eating meat was a serious legal offence. Violating these rules could lead to public penance or heavy fines for the household. The law also focused on the quality and honesty of food production. Bakers who sold underweight bread were treated as dangerous criminals by the town. If a merchant was caught cheating, they might face the cucking stool or other public humiliations to show everyone that the law protected the buyer. Standardization was enforced with an iron hand. Every market had official measures, and using your own was a direct violation of the king's law. Hunger was no excuse for law-breaking. The collective spiritual and social health of the community was prioritized over the individual's need for a full stomach. Even the act of cooking was regulated. Many peasants were legally required to use the lord's mill and oven, paying a portion of their food. Ale tasters were official government employees. They travelled from tavern to tavern, ensuring that the beer sold to the public met the strict legal standards. Selling spoiled food was a crime against the community. The punishment often involved being forced to stand with the offending food until it rotted away. Sumptuary laws applied to food as well. The number of courses you could serve at a dinner was strictly limited based on your social status. To eat like a king when you were a peasant was a legal defiance. The law used every meal to reinforce the social boundaries of the era. Food security was a matter of state. Hoarding grain during a famine was a capital offence, punished with the most extreme severity by the law. Even the silence of a meal was often a matter of regulation. The law and the church sought to control the mind as much as the mouth. Every spice and every grain of salt had a legal and social value. To possess them was to participate in a highly regulated economic system. When the day ended, the law of the stomach followed the law of the light. Life was a constant dance of obedience and survival in medieval times. Your work was not just a job, it was a legal status. Most trades were governed by powerful guilds that held the force of law. You could not simply decide to be a carpenter or a mason. You had to be legally accepted into a guild after years of apprenticeship. The law dictated the path of your career from childhood. Once you entered a trade, you were bound to its rules and its strict social hierarchy. Guilds regulated quality with an iron fist. If your work was found to be substandard, you could be fined or even banned from the trade. To practice a trade without guild membership was an illegal act. You would be treated as a criminal and forced out of the local economy. The law also fixed prices and wages. Competition was seen as a threat to social stability, so the law ensured everyone earned a set amount. Even the hours you could work were legally mandated. Working past dark or on holy days was a violation that the guild would punish swiftly. These laws protected the market but destroyed individual initiative. Every product was a reflection of the collective standard, not the maker's own unique vision. The guild was your family, your insurance, and your judge. To be cast out was to lose your identity and your means of survival in society. Underground economies existed, but they were dangerous. The law was always searching for those who dared to work outside the established guild system. Your legal status in the guild followed you to the grave. The law ensured that even in death, the order of the trade was maintained properly. Education was a legal process. Learning a trade was a contract between the master, the student, and the law, with strict penalties for any breach. Trade was the lifeblood of the city. And the law ensured that not a single drop was spilled without the proper authority and the right fee. Discipline was physical and legal. Masters had the authority to punish their apprentices, a right protected and even encouraged by the local town laws. These regulations built the cathedrals and the cities of Europe. They were the invisible skeleton that held the entire medieval economy together in place. Uniformity was the goal. In a world of chaos, the law of work provided a predictable, if stifling, structure for every man's labour and life. Justice in the Middle Ages was not done behind closed doors. It was a public performance designed to instill fear and enforce social conformity. Public shaming was the most common form of punishment. The law believed that the eyes of your neighbours were more powerful than any prison cell. Offenders were often forced to wear signs describing their crimes. This ensured that their identity as a lawbreaker was visible to everyone they encountered. The goal was to strip the criminal of their dignity. Once your honour was taken in public, it was almost impossible to ever regain your standing. Physical pain was a secondary goal to the psychological impact. The sight of blood and suffering served as a graphic warning to the entire population. The ultimate punishment was always visible. The presence of the gallows on the horizon was a constant reminder of the final power of the law. The executioner was a professional of the law. His role was to perform a ritualized act of violence that restored the divine order of the kingdom. Every execution was a religious event. The law sought not just to end a life, but to save a soul through public repentance and suffering. The state's monopoly on violence was absolute. These displays of power were essential to maintaining the fragile peace of the medieval city-state. Branding was a permanent legal record on the body. A thief would carry the mark of their crime forever, making them an eternal outcast from society. In some cases, the bodies of the executed were left on display for years. The law used the dead to speak to the living about obedience. Children were encouraged to watch. It was a vital part of their education in the ways of the world and the consequences of moral failure. Not all punishments were violent. Some involved long, arduous acts of public penance designed to humble the offender and show their total submission to law. The spectacle was over, but the message remained. The law had spoken, and the community had witnessed the restoration of the social and moral order. Everything was recorded. The bureaucracy of death and punishment was as meticulous as the collection of taxes or the recording of land deeds. The architecture of the city itself was designed to witness the law. The stones were stained with the history of 1,000 public judgments. Property and land were the foundation of all medieval power, and the laws governing them were incredibly complex and often very heavily contested. Ownership was not a simple concept. Land was often held in a complex web of feudal obligations, where everyone owed service to someone higher up. The law ensured that the land stayed in the hands of the powerful. If a peasant failed their duties, they could be legally evicted and ruined. Disputes over boundaries could last for generations. The law courts were filled with cases where ancient trees or stones were the primary evidence used. The law was a weapon for debt collection. Property could be seized instantly to satisfy a claim, leaving the poor with absolutely nothing for survival. Inheritance was a legal minefield. Without a clear and legally recognized will, a family's property could be taken by the crown or the local lord. When the law failed to resolve property disputes, the result was often violence. The legal system was the only thing standing between peace and total chaos. Everything was mapped and measured. The law sought to bring order to the wild landscape, turning every hill and stream into a legal entity. Tradition and law were intertwined. These communal rituals were a way of teaching the legal boundaries of the land to the next generation of citizens. Property laws allowed for the growth of cities. They provided the stability needed for long-term investment and the creation of the modern urban world. The king's forest was a legal fortress. The animals and the wood were off limits to everyone else, protected by some of the harshest laws ever written. The key to survival was ownership or service. In the medieval legal world, you either owned the land or you were owned by the rules of it. These laws did not exist in a vacuum. They were the very fabric of a society that valued collective order above almost every individual's personal freedom. To the people who lived then, these rules were as natural as the rain. They followed them because they were the only reality they ever knew. We find them strange only because we look through the lens of the present. But in the context of the Middle Ages, they were simply common sense. This was their world, and these were their laws, a strange, brutal, and fascinating way that things simply used to work for all of us.